Yours is symmetric. And there you have that. This is a shtick I do, so I'll take a minute here to say, so who has a disability here? And that depends on context. So Ruth is a semi-professional singer, sings all the time in Symphony Hall, Boston, and so on. She's a good singer. And her, I should say though, Ruth grew up in Southern California, right here in San Gabriel, and then Mission Viejo. So I'm back in her home country. Anyway, so she grew up and was terrific at music. And when we met in Oregon as teachers, she had no idea that I would have this very symmetric and underconnected auditory cortex, and assumed, because I had many years of music lessons, that I would be a good mate for her. But in fact, it took a lot of years for her to realize that we had these very different nervous systems. And worse, that I passed it on to our children, so that our children are also underconnected in auditory cortex. And Ruth has now a whole family of disabled people that she mothers. And it's a great disappointment in her life. On the other hand, there are contexts in which things are quite reversed. So in Symphony Hall, I look very disabled and I can't do it. I'm not qualified, wouldn't get to be. But we go to a Unitarian Universalist church together, and an old New England church. And in church, things are quite different. For one thing, I sing loud in church because that's the whole point. I'm only there, once a week. And but I'm not perfectly on pitch, just like you would be. So it's not great. And the other people around her are not also singing on pitch perfectly. Everybody's a little off. But the worst case is that the organ is very old. It's a 100-year-old organ. And it's drifted away from playing 440 when you press the A key. So in fact, it's playing a full step, almost a full step and a half below that. So picture Ruth with perfect pitch. She looks at the hymn book. She sees it's an A. She knows exactly what to do. She knows what it sounds like. She knows how to sing it. But her husband sitting next to her is not singing an A. Nobody in the church is singing an A. And the organ isn't even playing an A. So in fact, Ruth mumbles in church because it's quite disabling to be in this kind of environment. And I sing loud, and I love the irony that once a year, people in our church ask if I'd like to join the choir, which is pretty funny, given that Ruth is really not an expert singer. But nobody knows Ruth can sing because the context is disabling for her. In fact, people with perfect pitch will talk about their perfect pitch as a disability because so many conditions call for relative pitch. And in fact, perfect pitch is a disability under those circumstances. So I just want to put that pitch in because we're going to talk about what we began, as Mark said, with disability, but in fact, most disability looks like that. It's highly contextually determined. I don't know where to draw any edges between who's disabled and who's not. Ruth's disabled in some circumstances with pitch, and I'm much more able than some with the same thing with pitch. And as we'll talk about today, there are great technologies that change the environment. I like to talk about the Glee website. It has a karaoke feature, which is really nice. So you come on, you sing into the website, and then it has a little button that says, "Would you like pitch correction?" And I go, "Well, of course I would." And then what I can do is sing with great enthusiasm and great emotion, whatever, and then correct the pitch afterwards. So technologies have enormous powers to allow us to perform high-level things, that is interpreting the song correctly, and not worry too much about the pitch. It's annoying, very annoying to someone like Ruth. To get us a little closer to things we'll talk about, and you probably know this, the brain specializes in things like pitch, but here's one's in vision. And the amount of specialization is really strikingly interesting. that is, the areas where you would recognize faces is distinctly different from places where you'd recognize things like houses. And written words has its own place, and so on. Visual word form area, those that study reading. That kind of specialization in the connectome was not what people expected when I was doing early neuroscience, but now we know the way the nervous system actually forms itself. And there are people who are who have much more cortex devoted to things like faces, or much less, or much more cortex devoted to written words, or much less, and so on, all of these. So you can have people who are face blind, for example, but who are not generally blind, and who may be good readers, but bad at recognizing faces, and so on. And the new technologies allow us to actually look at the ways in which the nervous system operates when it's doing, the ways in which different nervous systems operate when they're doing the same task. Here, the task of reading. And the studies have gotten to be really beautiful. Some of you are here interested in reading, you've probably seen these. But good readers, highlight here for words, show a nice bright use of cortex here when they're recognizing words. Dyslexics don't light up that part of the cortex when they're doing words at all. Reading in a different, with a different nervous system and applying it differently. And more of the studies now that are coming out look at individual differences in ways that are different than we used to. So this is a study I really liked, came out last year, looking at typically developing children versus children with autism. And the difference isn't that children with autism have some kind of hole in their head or some degenerative disease. They're in fact hyper-connected in the same way that Ruth's auditory cortex is hyper-connected. They have a very different nervous system. But when you look at it, you don't go, oh my God, it's broken. You go, wow, it looks like a perfect pitch break. And in fact, the incidence of perfect pitch is greatly elevated in people who have autism. And what's sad in the way schooling works is we pull them out of things like chorus to put them in remedial reading, when in fact they could be stars in the chorus, so we hate that. So universal design approach says you gotta be paying attention to what they're good at as well as what they're bad at. So this connectome view of individual differences blurs all sorts of distinctions about disability and ability, and the power of context to shape all of this is profound, and so on. So what does this mean for teachers and educational designers? The problem that we face in school is that most technologies, printed book will be my whipping horse here, are fixed and uniform. Everybody gets the same thing, but we have varied learners, diverse in incredibly rich ways, all trying to get squeezed through the same kind of technology. And the result of that is that children are seen as the problems, that they are disabled, they are under something, there's something wrong with them, and we send them out. I used to do this for a living. I was a neuropsychologist who evaluated kids for learning problems. And what you did was kids were sent out of school. This kid can't learn for whatever reason. You find out why. Universal Design for Learning is taking the opposite approach, and I want to make that argument here. And it's partly because new media changes these equations very strongly. And primarily, the ability to separate information from its display device gives us incredible flexibility that we don't have in fixed media like print, so that we can take the same information, display it in multiple formats, but also in even different sensory modalities. We can take that same information and do it visually, but we can also put it out as refreshable Braille now, so you can feel it immediately. You don't have to send it out to a Braille press or something. So same digital content can be shown visually or haptically, or as you know, and now this used to be something only for people with disabilities. Now everything you have in your iPad speaks itself aloud. Every text, it's automatic for everybody. But you can take that and put it out as, there's an avatar now that will make it into sign language too. So we have enormous capacity to take a single kind of information, as long as it's digital, and put it out in a richer set of formats, and as we'll call it, representation, so that more people can have access to it. Let me just stop. Everybody looked like really bored at the beginning. I'm just trying to see what Am I doing okay? Is this all right?
We're fascinated.
Okay, okay. All right, well, tell me. So a couple of advertisements to say. So I was thinking after Mark's call about what would, so I'm going to propose the most sort of outrageous thing that we might do together. And so this is the setup for that. This is part of a little bit of the sell. And I'm sure we won't quite do what I'm going to suggest. But UDL has taken off. And I want to just give you a sense of what this landscape is looking like now. It began with this national legislation, or NIMAS legislation, the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, which we in part, we headed the NIMAS development project, which included many people from California. And the I'm not going to go much into the NIMAS standard, but it specified a XML-based, at the time, format in which all schools had to provide for students as alternatives to print-based books. And it was the first time in public law that something was said that said printed books are not good enough. And it literally said it mandated by law. You cannot teach school and only provide printed books anymore. The NIMAS legislation makes that as a national standard from U.S. Congress. And in so doing, very quickly though, U.S. Congress actually defined universal design for learning, which is a higher grade than merely the NIMAS provision, but getting it into language in Congress to say, this is what universal design for learning is, and schools of education should do it, is what they said. There's no force of law saying you'll be penalized for not doing it, but it's the first time to actually define it, and it talks about what does it do? It provides flexibility in the way information is presented, in the way students respond to demonstrate, and in the way students are engaged. 3 principles we'll talk about. Congress, I love it. My experience of working with Congress was that they're like junior high students, that they would come and copy our website, but then change the words enough to look like it wasn't exactly copied. We thought it was very good. In fact, some of it was better written than ours, so we adopted their language. And reduced various instructions for all kinds of things. And it's led to a revised view of the problem. And it comes in the NIMAS legislation. What is it for? It addresses the national need to increase the availability and timely delivery of print instruction materials in accessible formats to blind or other students with print disabilities in elementary and secondary schools. This is the first time I ever heard the word print disabilities. And it's a radical change. At first it was kind of subtle and a lot of people didn't notice it. But it's the beginning of the real shift toward universal designs, in that it says that the problem that students are having is co-located, that it's not correct to think of it as something entirely resident in students, but in fact it's co-resident in print. There are students for whom print does not work, and you can no longer ignore that fact and just make printed documents. Print has its own disabilities, and that's the way we interpret it. And in fact, our argument now is that schools are hobbled by their print disabilities. They have instructional instruments that are broken, rather than the old view, which is the kids are broken. It's our job to make good instructional environments, and right now we're using very disabled instruments. So schools have print disabilities the way we talk about it. Now I'm working on something that I'm going to only somewhat jokingly call the neuropsych evaluation of the curriculum, and looking at what are the actual disabilities that you see in a curriculum. This is something I think it would be good to do in terms of online learning. But sometimes I do this with parents, and I get this incredibly deep, visceral feeling from parents when I say, what kind of disabilities does your school have? And at first there's pause, like, I can't think that way. And then someone sooner or later says, well, you know, my school's sort of autistic. And then it sort of mushrooms as they say, you know what, actually, it only can write in English, and I speak Spanish. It's, you know, blah, blah, and people come out with this anger of that my kid has been the victim of a not very well designed curriculum, a much too narrowly designed curriculum. And my kid's been seen as the problem, whereas the school is just not a very good school, the curriculum's not well designed, etc. I like this. This is an article that came out. Have you seen this article?
No.
I love the title of it, isn't it great? It's just the fact is that actually we have much more dyslexics in the United States than they do in other countries. Why? Because English is a dyslexic language. There's just a better way to look at it. It's not like there's nothing different about kids who have dyslexia, but you have to see it's co-determined by the fact that the English orthography is a clear part of the elevated incidence of dyslexia in English. What is all this doing? It's changing state policies. I just clipped these off on my way here. Are you all aware that there was a recent task force here in California? This is happening in lots of states. Came out, I don't know, 3 months ago. One system, reforming education to serve all students, reported California's statewide task force on special education, saying we got to do special education completely differently. And it goes, there's too much text here, but recommendations. The first recommendation, in support of these changes, California should ensure the following. Universal design for learning is understood, is established as a key area of professional learning for educator training, and is implemented in all schools. Okay, so this is California. Now, this is not implemented as a law, but a 2-year task force comes up and says their first recommendation is universal design for learning should be adopted throughout California. U.S. Department of Ed just put out an EdTech Develops Guide. Everybody see this? Great, okay. So probably didn't notice, but one of the key features of that, it has universal design for learning. So in the guidelines of what should EdTech developers do, they should do universal design for learning. This is just advertising, sorry. This came while I was on the plane. District Administration, it's a magazine that goes to district administrators. And it's Common Core update. Special education tactics aid Common Core success. Universal design for learning addresses students' individual learning needs to reach standards. And there's a whole article about why if you're going to do Common Core, you better do UDL. So we're kind of seeing a lot of this happening. Okay, so that's just, again, advertising to say this is something relatively serious. It's not sort of 10 people. And there's a lot more of this. Lots of states have UDL initiatives now. So just to advertise where I want to go, that I'm hoping, and I'm assuming that we are called in part because there'll be increasing demand that online technologies follow the principles of UDL, but no one has ever tested it. There's no test of would it actually help. Even though the U.S. Department of Education recommends it, the state of California, state of Maryland, blah, 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 all sorts of people are saying you should do it. But it'd be really powerful if we actually said, what's the data look like if you really do it? Okay? And there are people that do it, but just nobody's done really good testing. Anyway, so I just want to check my time.
Sorry, to clarify, there's never been a test of online UDL, or there's never been a randomized controlled trial?
Never been a randomized controlled trial, a good, what we'd all call good research to say, if you did UDL, the outcomes are better.
Okay.
For whom, how, you know, da-da-da.
Got it.
Thanks. Yeah. Shocking.
So just to push on the for whom, I mean, is this a good time? Because I don't want to get you off message. It's quite entertaining.
Why don't you ask? And I'll decide.
Well, oh wait, I'm not competing with Bob.
You're right, you can't compete with Bach. After the Bach, we'll ask it again. Oh, I didn't ask for a microphone. Catch up.
A microphone, a speaker connected to the laptop? I think it is connected to a. It connects.
There's sound.
There's sound if it's plugged in. For there,
There you go.
It's right up front. Sounds good, Josh. Thank you. Okay, so this is just a.
Josh is our jack of all trades.
This is just meant to give you, because there's always a kind of sense of, God, this looks like it might be really boring, and I want to. So I like to kind of stop in the middle and talk about Bach. So imagine that I played a little piece, and I'm going to skip it because I don't want to take much time to also talk about it. But I jump into the middle of a piece, typically, if I'm going to show this, and say, ask you comprehension questions about it. What's going on? What's Bach doing here? and you would fail. Okay, you got it. Can everybody picture that you do terrible? Okay. All right, so I can give you another representation of it and say this is what's going on. And for some, only few of you in the group, you would say, oh, I see what he's doing. He's inverting this and da-da-da. Lots of you would, this representation would not help in any way, right? Okay, but there are neat representations which do use the power of new technologies. Let's see, here's one of my favorites.
Hmm.
So you even see the passing chords. Just watch this figure, which is a little bit hard to hear and crystal clear visually. Okay, so you get the idea. Actually, go sometimes spend an hour doing this because it gets really rich when we get into the fugue, because you start to follow a theme and you can see him turn it over and extend it and do all these things because he captures it beautifully visually. So you actually really, for the first time, understand what a fugue is and what Bach's doing and why he can play the same theme 30 to 50 times and it sounds rich each time because he plays it against context. The whole thing comes very clear, even to people who don't read music, blah, 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 people who don't speak English, all of that. So this is for us, I'm going to skip the doing the fugue because we can do that if we have lots of time later. This is following the first principle of universal design. Provide multiple means of representation. And there are three things that come out again out of the neurosciences. What are the things we have to be careful about? Making sure everybody can perceive it. So this says, oh, you can either watch it or you can hear it, blah, blah, blah. Making sure that you use language and symbols that are accessible to everybody. So you can do these weird, very simple things. You don't have to read music, or you can look at the music if you want to, or you can just listen. But this is just a different symbolic representation of music, an alternative. And the point is to get to comprehension. And what he does here is really uses color and the place on the scale to help you comprehend. And typically I help show people what it means to comprehend, to provide support for comprehension by explaining what a fugue is. Because typically, if you don't even know what a fugue is, it's hard to get into this piece. But once a fugue is explained, you go, oh, I see what he's doing. Just a small piece of background knowledge can open up, break open sort of the comprehension that's required for understanding a piece like this. So, multiple means of representation is just meant to give a sexy example. We can look at reading and math and stuff in a moment. And three guidelines about perception, about language and symbols, and about comprehension. How do we provide support so that everybody can do it? Here's what we've done. All we've done is taken other people's research and put it together to say there are options that we can provide in the digital world for perception. We can provide alternatives for auditory information. It's very easy to provide captions in the digital environment. Alternatives for visual information, like I just did. Provide sound as well, and there's ways to customize display. Just options can easily be done in the digital world, can't be done in the print world. Options for language and symbols. What do they do? Making sure that all the vocabulary is understandable by everybody. In the digital world, it's easy for us to do that. To say, every word, if you don't know it, click on it. It will tell you what it is. So you don't have to have it in your head. You don't have to have, across languages. You don't have to speak English. We can build into the technology itself alternatives for English, We can do the same for syntax. We can do the same for decoding of text. Even if you're a poor decoder, we can demand high levels of comprehension. Even if you come in with a very limited vocabulary, we can demand high levels of comprehension, high levels of strategic reading, because we can provide the supports in the technology. So that's what Universal Design for Learning does, it says. We've got to have these options.
David?
Yeah.
Well, this is relevant to the next point, which is comprehension. But I think one thing that I think I've always tried to keep in mind is, and maybe because I have a background in second language acquisition, is, to me, Universal Design for Learning has two important goals in terms of, say, comprehension. One is to help people comprehend the material at hand, but one is to build up people's abilities to comprehend material in the future.
Yeah.
And there are ways that you can help people comprehend the material at hand, which also might help them better comprehend material in other environments in the future. And there are ways that can reduce, so to me, that's one thing that perhaps to keep in mind is, what kinds of transformations of texts accomplish both of those things.
Sometimes we show examples of where people do universal designs, which actually take the learning out of the equation completely. There are lots of them where people do universal designs and no learning happens at all, because of the kind you want, which is the next time I do this, I have more strategies, more skills to bring to it. Absolutely right. So comprehension, there are ways we can activate or supply background knowledge within our environments. We can highlight patterns. That's what the Bach did. It was just highlighting the patterns so you could see them better. It's a great technique. Tons of research about it. All of these things are lots of research based underneath this. We just captured them, talked about them. Okay. I want to just take a moment to look at reading specifically. And I was expecting, do we have any reading people here?
Where's Penelope?
You certainly done it. You have. Okay,
Josh.
so good. And you've done
I've done
studies.
reading.
Penelope was supposed to be here. She'll be here tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit more about reading tomorrow morning. She'll be here.
All right. So I just want to take an example of reading, and it's partly the question you've asked, Mark. So this is the old simple view of reading. And oh, Josh, you're here. Yeah. Simple view of reading. We all learned this. There was two things: decoding and language comprehension. Getting to reading was doing those two things mainly. And you recall decoding happens here, and the old view was that comprehension happens in a couple places. Pretty simple idea. But I just want to show you what actually looks like when the brain is reading. It's not two little simple places. That's just single word reading. And you notice, I'll play it again. Notice how much of the brain lights up. Look. It's not the little decoding area. It's not those two comprehension areas. Most of neocortex is lighting up. And in fact, the new studies, which I love, and I won't spend much time on it today, but people have studied, well, what really lights up when they look at individual sentences that have specific kinds of content, and they'll look at, when you're reading about character, what lights up? And you know what lights up? Temporal neocortex, with which you recognize your friends and people. That's what lights up. So when you're reading a passage and it's telling you about a character, you're running a simulation in your neocortex, but you're running the simulation with the exact part of cortex that you actually recognize people with. That's how you know what you're reading about, is you run a simulation. You say, I'm going to make up that character right here with the part of the brain that I recognize characters. If you're reading about a goal a character has, you light up prefrontal cortex. You are running a simulation of someone having a goal, and so you light up the goal yourself. And similarly, go around the brain. So it just took sentences. So what's this sentence about? And they look at what lit up, and it changes. But in its aggregate, you can see that most of the brain lights up when you're a good reader. You're attacking text by running these simulations throughout cortex. So this idea that it's simple, that decoding is this big part of it, decoding is a very small part of it, and the old language parts are only a very small part of it. This enormously richer thing we do when we comprehend. This is what we want students to be able to do, is to engage their full neocortex in actual comprehension. And readers come to this, though, from very different pathways. Dyslexic decode very differently. And we talked about that. but I just captured these studies just the other day just to show you examples. There's tons of studies of people who come to reading very differently. Their brains, the connectomes are quite different. They're not reading in the same ways. But to be successful, they need to do this. However the entry route is, they need to do this, okay? And there's many entry routes. Okay, and almost done with this section. So how does university design technology change the pathways to reading? We can do things like outsource the decoding. You can say, okay, decoding is you're not very good at decoding. In the old days, there was no other route. When we had print, you had to decode. It was just the nature of the technology. But now, every word decodes itself, and if people used to always say to me when I would say this, but David, what about when you're in the woods and there's a trail sign? But now, as you know, Intel's got a little chip that if you just point your cell phone at it, it reads it to you. So you don't actually have to decode. You do have to understand what the sign means. There's still comprehension involved, but decoding is actually something you can outsource. We can outsource vocabulary, blah, 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 and go through that whole list we talked about, okay? And I'll go a little bit faster now. I just finished talking about multiple means of representation. We can embed so much in there to make sure everybody comprehends. But that's not all there is when you read. It's actually richer than that. And that's why the whole brain lit up. That you actually read with the front part of your brain too. And the part of your brain that allows you to be strategic, to execute things, including what we call executive functions. This is all the front part of your brain. The very, very front part is executive prefrontal cortex, where you do executive functions. And just because we're in high-tech area, I think most people know who Tim Berners-Lee is, the founder of the web. So Tim actually goes to that same church Ruth and I sing in. What's interesting about Tim, some of you have heard him talk, Tim has about as little executive function as anybody you'll ever meet. He's ADHD in the quintessential. And I like to describe Tim's way of conversing. Tim's very hard to follow, and people want him to write out his speeches because he gets distracted in his own talks. And I think if you've heard him, and you're not sure what he's going to talk about. So, you know, when he gets his knighthood, they had him write it out because they wanted to actually stick on topic. But he gets distracted in the middle of sentences. He'll launch a sentence. Those of you that are linguists here, he'll launch a sentence midway through his sentence. You can see he gets bored with his own sentence. You can see where it's going to go. He figures, and so he launches a new sentence. And you, in comprehending it, are trying to figure out where was that sentence going to go, and then try to catch up with him. You're nodding. Have you heard him talk? It's really amazing. Just sit in.
No, I have one at home.
One or three?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so you have this. Anyway, so Tim's a great example. The reason I want to use Tim is because, of course, it shows that, in fact, you can be really super smart, and you can do super smart things, even if you're like this. And the technologies are around that can help you. There are ones that can help you express yourself, like, what's his name? Stephen Hawking, who would have been in an institution in the old days, but now he's a world-class physicist because he's got output channels that work. And Tim can use things like this. There's apps for self-control where you put in, I don't want to be distracted by anything for the next half hour, and it just shuts off Facebook and Instagram and stuff for you. And the powerful thing is that it can't be overridden. See, if it be overridden, you just override it all the time. You know, you don't say, oh, wait a minute, I just want to check email for just a second. But once you put in, I don't want to be distracted for half an hour, it keeps you out for half an hour. It's great. But it's so we can outsource self-control. And,
I'm out of a job.
And some of you have lots of devices you outsource. When you're dieting, you have outsourced control. You just don't get to the refrigerator. We have a lot of, I'm going to skip a little bit. We've built environments that outsource executive function, planning, strategy development stuff in reading spaces where kids who don't have good strategic control can get help. And then we study things like how do kids look at text, and look at the difference between two kids looking at the same text. Just incredibly different strategically. Very hard to see these as the same thing. They're being incorporated through very different nervous systems. Mm-hmm. So one is incredibly different way of reading the text than the other. And I love this. I'm beating this drum every time now. There's a bunch of studies like this. I'll let you see what the title is. Comprehending the Gray Oral Reading Test Without Reading It. Why comprehension tests should not include passage-independent items. Now, what's that mean? Well, actually, a bunch of studies have been done now, and they've done it with Gray Oral is kind of the gold standard for reading tests, but they've done it on the other ones as well. And all they do is that they don't provide the passage at all. They just give the test and say, you're confronted only with questions. And some kids do great with no passage. And by the way, kids with dyslexia do no different, whether the passage is there or not, which I think is a wonderful example. What they are is supremely strategic. They think about what these answers are, which would be a good answer, and they're very strategic. So they're being strategic even though they haven't read the item at all. Okay, so strategy is a key part of reading comprehension. And in fact, even when there's nothing to read. And blah, 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 more brain stuff on this skip. The last part of universal design for learning is really the most important part in our work now. I would say, and I think I said to this on the phone, that the energy at CAST is really about the affective part now. Emotions, motivation, stuff like that. That we have made things that you can read if you're dyslexic and stuff like that. And it's kind of trivial to do that. But how do we get kids to invest in learning things that would seem to be important to us? And here too, kids are really different from one another. And there are 3 guidelines. One's about recruiting interest, one's about sustaining effort, and one's about self-regulation. What are the research-based things you can do in an online environment to support kids in recruiting their interest in sustaining effort in self-regulation? And these are addressing that 3rd area of the brain, affective part. Role of emotions. Emotions are there to optimize according to core value. If I had longer talk, I'd like to talk about where values are in the nervous system. But this is the part of the brain where values are. What's important to you is coded here in this part of the connectome. And you optimize according to those core values what you're going to seek out, what you're going to attend to, what you're going to remember, what you're going to predict, what you're going to achieve. This is the driver of the nervous system, this central part. If you change things here, if you have damage here, you change people in ways that people say, that's not Mark anymore. If you take out visual cortex, people still say, that's Mark, you just can't see. But if you mess around here, people say, that's not Mark, because it changes his priorities, changes his values, changes what he attends to, what he remembers, what all of those things, and it doesn't feel like Mark anymore. And how powerful, has anybody heard of Capgras syndrome? All right, yeah. Just want to check.
You have to tell us what Capgras syndrome is. That's not an option at this point.
So Capgras is my favorite neurological syndrome, and it shows how powerful this part of the brain is. And I think at first you won't believe this really happens, but you can go to YouTube and see the videos. So Capgras is a patient arrives, goes to a psychiatrist because they've been referred by their doctor, and they report that that their spouse has been taken over by an alien. It could be a Martian, it could be the CIA, that something has taken over their loved one. And it looks like, I'm going to use the gender, it looks like her, but it's not her anymore. And you can bring the person in and you say, does that look like what? It looks exactly like her, but it's not her anymore. What happens is that in Capgras syndrome, at first it was thought to be a psychiatric disorder, something happened between you and your mother, and now it's known to be a fairly small lesion that separates the affective cortex I'm talking about here from visual cortex. And just that little separation makes the following happen. That your visual cortex is working great and says, that does indeed look exactly like my wife. Nothing's wrong about perception. But your nervous system is always coding the significance of everything. How important is this to me? How do I value this? Everything, all the time. You don't think of it, you don't notice it, we make it explicit by attaching up to physiology. but it's all the time happening. So what's happening is when the person at Capgras, visual cortex, person says, looks like my wife, but it doesn't feel like my wife. The feelings aren't there that go with it. So typically when you see your wife, there's a whole set of feelings that come out of your nervous system and which are shown in things like a GSR, shown in EEG, things like that, but you don't feel them all the time, except in rushes of mad love and stuff, or disappointment, things like that. But anyway, those feelings are always part of your recognition of the person. So what happens here is that your brain is faced with a dilemma. It looks like her, but it doesn't feel like her. Which one wins? And that's why I like this syndrome, because what wins is affect. People think we're a visual organism, but we're an affective organism. That no matter how much it looks like the spouse, if it doesn't feel like her, that overrides. And what happens is the nervous system has to make up a story. We're story-making machines, and the nervous system makes up a whole story about an imposter. It's called the imposter syndrome. Your nervous system can't handle these two discordant views, and it completely overrides your vision and says that's not her. Isn't that amazing? I just want you to know how powerful affect is. It will override vision. Okay? And Capgras is just an example of it. Maybe last anecdote, when I was an undergrad, I was Skinner's last undergraduate student. He didn't retire because of me. There's all this talk about sort of intrinsic and extrinsic and all of that. But I've had a chance to kind of review my whole history. So I was a really straight learning theorist for a few years after undergrad, but my job in the lab was to starve the pigeons. Okay, and some of you are old enough to know. If you read any of the articles from traditional operant, it will always read 16 male white cardinal pigeons at 80% body weight. Okay, so that's me, starving to get them to 80% body weight. And that made them look incredibly motivated to peck at those little keys. Okay, but that is an artifice of manipulating something internal about that. I just want to make a point that it's never entirely external, because there's a lot of studies done even by people north of here that think of things that attract people's attention are largely external. And I just want to say that's not happening. That in fact, what made the key peck interesting to my pigeons was the fact that they were starving. Then I could get them to pay attention. But pigeons are a lot like...
I try that with my students.
Yes, I always say, we could get kids to pay attention. There is no question we have techniques.
You'd be in jail, but
you have to manipulate values. You have to make the person starving so that they say, I'm going to pay attention even though I don't want to that key peck. I like to say pigeons are really much like junior high students in that when you leave them alone and you try to do that, they're randy and rolling around. They're looking at each other. They're preening. They're pecking. They're like, don't pay any attention to you. You have to put them in a cage all by themselves, and you have to starve them if you want to get them to do the learning stuff. Okay.
Jackie, is that?
wow. So
Jackie, I didn't introduce Jackie.
I now say whenever I talk, teaching is emotional work at its heart. That's what drives it all. And people think teaching is cognitive work. The cognitive stuff is actually the easy stuff. And there's no movies. All the great movies, when you think about them, in Good Will Hunting and Stand and Deliver, what are they about? They're all about the emotional part of teaching, because that's the part that actually makes a difference. If we get kids to invest in it, get kids to care about it, then actually long division comes pretty easy. What we have is mostly kids who don't care about the things that we're trying to do. And teaching is very emotional work. And Jackie, so I actually want to talk to you. Okay. We've been looking at three aspects, and we're writing a chapter, I think it's going to be a book, I hope, on what we're calling emotional design. How do you do emotional design and universal design of emotional stuff? And we want to separate out, there's multiple levels of it. There's attracting attention. There's a lot of people who see that as what emotional design is, and all the Madison Hamlin types is what is it? What is it about color? What is it about shape? What is it about motion? Things like that that attract your attention. The reason I wanted to say the thing about Skinner is that we can manipulate whether those things actually attract your attention by starving you or feeding you or doing making you afraid or all kinds of things. But there are certainly external things in the world that attract your attention. Some biologically, some because you've learned things. But a second level, which is much more interesting for us as educators, is how do we get kids to sustain engagement where they're actually wrestling with material and trying to learn things and so on, and sustaining the practice that real deep learning is going to require. And that's very different than merely attracting attention to it, and requires different principles and different things that we talk about to do that. The thing that we're most interested in is how do we support kids moving beyond engagement? Engagement is often the things like flow, where you can be really, really engaged. But what in education, and education is essentially an investment of the culture in, we do this now, but the benefits won't be evident until later. And a kid who is learning in the ways that we like in school is practicing something now because they want to do better later. They're gonna, everything is, even like regressing when you're reading a passage, that's a commitment, an investment, extra effort. One of the things we study is, do kids ask for help? You've studied this, okay. And asking for help is an investment. It says, I'm gonna take a little bit longer now, so more effort to ask for help, even to click on a button to get help. But it's an investment in that if I do this, something better will happen later. I'll comprehend this, I'll do better on a test or whatever. And we've become very interested in what are the ways in which we can, in the design of our stuff, encourage kids to start investing, to make choices, like regressing so I'll comprehend, like choosing and asking for help, like practicing on their own instead of choosing a harder level of reading than their present level and so on. And more on that later, and I'm going to skip to the more stories, but I have stories about emotional development, which are there's lots of research about how do we emotional design so that we can in fact engage all learners. And I think you all are very aware of studies of things like stereotype threat. Kids come into any learning situation with very different emotional histories and with emotional baggage coming from the culture in which they've grown up. And the shocking thing is how manipulable, and actually it seems in some cases very lightly manipulable, we can change that emotional baggage so that kids in fact can invest in something and in some learning. And things like Carol Dweck's work on how do we give feedback? What are the ways in which we give feedback so that it encourages mastery, that investment, rather than quickly doing things and thinking it's a sign of my intelligence, things like that. There are lots of research on how do we design so that more kids are in the mode of investment, in the mode of engagement than just attracting their attention. And I'll end with this sort of almost, this is just meant to tug at your heartstrings. But this is Ann Meyer working with a kid who's very physically disabled. He's locked-in syndrome. He can only move his chin. So he can't point or talk or walk or do anything like that. But he can move his lower facial musculature, that's it. And so we were, way back at the beginning, we didn't know what we were doing. But we knew that we needed to get to, oh good, we're at the emotional part of the pitch.
Get the Kleenex.
Very physically disabled kid. Chin was the only thing he could move reliably. And so we made a switch for him, put it under, and you'll see Ann's holding it under his chin. We just want to know, can he do it? Can he be intentional? Can he actually invest in learning if we give him an output device? Because he was headed for an institution. He was going to be the backboard. The school is slightly profound retarded. And his mother did not think he was profoundly retarded. And so this is the moment when we decided to become CAST. We were still a diagnostic facility. We were just trying things out. And here's the first time we see Matthew taking charge of learning. Oh, shit. Sorry, I didn't swear. Can you, Josh, can you look at it's only it's only a minute long. So, we're trying to teach him Morse code, because we don't know what we're doing. And we thought, at least he can do that if, it's something he could do. So Anne is trying to teach him Morse code, and we had to learn Morse code ourselves first.
Very good. Okay, wait a minute. Good, now long. Short, long. Okay, let's try again. Then long. Good. You know what happened when there's too long a pause? Matthew, this is hard work, and you are doing, you did it. You did it. You did it, right? Okay, yeah, Matt, hold it. Hey, you're ahead of me. How can you try ahead of me? Look at you.
He's typing up words he sees on the screen. Look at this.
You did it.
Look at that smile.
Thank you. Switch to state here.
I love it. That's the biggest smile anybody ever seen on Matthew's face ever. But the teacher cries. You see that? And goes, oh my God. And that's the sort of screen I use to say teaching's emotional work for both students and their teachers. And when we use technology well, we keep it emotional. We aren't trying to make it a flow machine. Anyway, so that's at the end of my shtick. Now, the question. You had a question.
About Bob? No.
How about a round of applause? Well, yeah, I think my question is fairly open-ended, so it's maybe appropriate.
it's better with the line.
At the beginning, you gave these
What was the line?
profiles of students, like taking literacy, for example. I mean, for whom,
sensitive.
I'm guessing you're saying that it is something about they have a
40
print,
bucks. What do you want?
what was the term? A print
Disability.
It's not like Mark had one.
But I mean, so obviously there's students who have a print disability, and then data from NAEP says that, like, the country has a reading challenge, right? And like middle school students who don't, I mean, presumably, like, so I mean, how many students are we talking about that you sort of thinking are fitting into different kinds of strategies that you've outlined?
Great question. There are kids who are very early have print disabilities in that they are having a lot of trouble with the decoding aspect. Okay? And so there's going to be many disabilities from print. One is that it requires decoding, and some people, that's the hard part of their nervous system, do that decoding part. What happens, though, in our school is we expand that disability often by limiting their reading to things they can decode, so that all of that rest of the brain stuff is not developed. The vocabulary, the syntax, the big knowledge structures that you need to be building are now limited by your decoding, so that we are essentially growing kids with more disabilities, so that by the time they're in high school, even if they finally caught up in decoding, they're so deprived of the amount of reading and language development that happens from reading all of those things that they still are print disabled.
Right, yeah.
That makes
I got you, but like, I'm just trying to, what percentage of people are you talking about as being print disabled? Because I mean, obviously, there's other kinds of challenges to reading. There's kids who aren't print disabled by any stretch of the imagination and are having all kinds of difficulties. So like, when your vision of this, like,
so I can tell you technically, the law is very carefully stipulates what print disability means. And there's only 4 categories. And it really is talking about the kids with decoding problems. it talks about kids who are blind, they have a print disability. Kids who are like Matthew, can't turn pages in a book, they have a print disability. And kids with reading disability, and by that they really mean a decoding disability, because they may be kids who are not, who have great comprehension abilities, as long as the decoding is not the entire gateway. So those numbers are fairly small. You know, it depends on the school, whether it's, but it's a small minority of 10% or something kids. Okay. But if you educate in ways that have print be the only vehicle to get there, then by the end you'll have a lot more that the law doesn't call print disabled, but I call print disabled. The kids who have stopped going to school, kids who are not reading for meaning anymore, or trying to find shortcuts to not read, all of those things. And so I think, I don't know what that number is, but it's a fairly large number by the time you're in high school.
I mean, I think this gets to sort of the question of evaluation. Is, are we, you know, evaluating for the 10% of students who have been identified as being print disabled, whatever
By law.
that means, or are you evaluating it for a much broader group of students that are, you know, because you sort of started off with a pretty clinical perspective on what you're talking about in terms of is this group and then there's this brain and there's that brain. But then what you laid out was like a very, very wide selection of tools.
So
that
great.
was like super, you know, expansive. We could apply to anybody.
So, and I do mean to go that far. That is, there are lots of kids who are not comprehending in high
What
school.
of our
Did you
children
just
do?
hear Kate run across the roof?
You're right, what is up there? On cue.
Danny, come down.
That's what my children do.
And I think Mark may have said that in the beginning, we always started with the really marginalized hardcore, the dyslexic. They have a bona fide, you can look at their grades and say they're not decoding in the same way other kids are. But I now see print as so limited that it in fact causing lots of kids to have problems in schools. And I see the larger definitions where we would want to approach it, that we're not after just kids with disabilities. But what is print disabling about kids becoming good at math, good at reading, good at geometry, all of those things? There's a wonderful book, what's it called, Beyond, by Jim Bailey, about how print ruined the teaching of mathematics. It used to be taught better when it was out in the world. And we tried to get it into printed books, and it made math become very different. And it made a whole set of disabilities about teaching math. So anyway, I'm not interested only in kids with disabilities. I'm interested in kids for whom the learning that we do now is not working. Yeah.
I have one question that's sort of relevant to my area of modeling and one that's more broad. So I'll start with the modeling one. You're talking about print disabilities, talking about people who have very big pitch and who don't. And a lot of this sounds like kind of binary, right? This is gene you have or you don't. And then we see, the development of interconnectedness, and you think, well, that could be a continuous thing.
Yeah.
But the way you're talking about it, the way it seems to manifest, at least with perfect pitch, is you have it or you don't. So
Great. I'm glad you asked that. It is
do
not.
we need a
binary.
model 2 to the n or
It is
some
totally.
crazy continuous value thing?
In fact, and you may be asking this, it's actually culturally determined as well. I just had to do the shorthand version. But actually, the incidence of perfect pitch varies by culture. Shaped by how valuable pitch is in the culture. So in Chinese culture, where pitch is more important, more people have perfect pitch. And where English is a language that doesn't have much pitch differentiation as part of language, so we're not very good at having. So they are curves. You're absolutely right, and that we just artificially divide them up sometimes. By the way, the same is true on the internal end. That kids with autism range from they're lousy as you are to they're exquisite. These things are never binary, as far as I can tell.
Both in the diagnostics and in the internal.
Yeah.
So then the broader question was, since the proposal is sort of targeting at-risk students, a lot of them to me would fall into the category of students who have a lot of baggage, right?
Yeah.
And where, yes, we want to make the
Right.
pedagogy as optimized as it can be, but a lot of times when they're sitting there in front of the screen, it's not even getting through. So, I mean, you alluded briefly to that sort of
Yeah.
alleviating of this baggage, but what can you talk more about
So,
that?
one of my doc students just did a really powerful study, looked at physiological measures. I'm sorry to be dancing with you, Jackie.
That's all right. That's
Uh,
fun.
Measured physiologically kids while they're reading. And this is one of those things where she didn't actually have to do any statistics. There were non-overlapping sets. She had struggling readers in middle school, non-struggling readers reading the same passage. And it just went like this. The struggling readers had so much baggage about their emotions and all of that failure and all of that that's happened to them over the last 6 years, that they were under stress. However you measured it, heart rate, skin conductance, whatever. They were in a stress state. They were, as we say, gazelles on the lion in a lion territory. Even though it was not a high stress situation, they were with an experimenter, not in front of their whole classmates or whatever, they still went boom like that. Some kids were physiologically under stress, which is not a great condition to be learning about the ways in which passages of Kierkegaard are different than Gabrielli or something. They're under stress.
Is there what's the approach to
So
mitigating that?
we, I don't know when, I mean, I'd like to show you sometime in the next day. So we've made a reading environment, which begins with, well, you can see it, but it begins with that the emotional barriers are the big one. If not in first grade, everybody's kind of cool. Oh, this is great. I'm going to like this. But if you start in middle school and up, we began to see that the first barrier you need to attack is the emotional baggage coming in and provide the right kinds of feedbacks and support and success to overcome a big, that dread, that fear, that long history of so we began in the reading, we have a $10 million project from the U.S. Department to develop an online reading environment. And we don't do any remediation. We start entirely with, you know what? Let's see if we can have kids have a good experience with reading first. Have a good experience as themselves as readers, good experience that reading is cool, there's good things to read. And let's do that for a long time before we, as you probably know, the remedial reading programs are really not very successful, like adult remedial reading programs. Most people drop out. And so actually and it was scary when we wrote this proposal. So Mark, this is a good example. We wrote this is going to be to a reading competition. We wrote a proposal that did not say we were going to teach any phonics, did not say we were going to teach any vocabulary. We were just going to have them read in a university designed environment, very supportive, and they're just going to be able to read what they wanted to and read a lot. And we won the competition. It was a big gamble, and I think we're going to win in the outcomes. And we have kids that are reading, and the teacher said, I never thought Billy would read, and they write, and they create things, because we never say, we try to say it's different. Okay, we don't show them any printed stuff, nor do we ever tell them what to read. We say, what would you like to read? We've got hundreds to thousands of things to read. We say, you're in charge of this.
So will this be the first experiment of UDL versus not?
Even I can't say it, to Drew's question, I can't even say it's a UDL test though, because it's so localized to just reading. But it would be one of, there's sort of things like that. But in their corpus, they don't say, there's not a good test. Someone would say, okay, well, you did some cool things, but other people would have recommended you did those things. That's not really a test of UDL. So I don't think it will be a criterial test.
So there's a control.
What's that?
There is a control.
We're going to have controls. In fact, yeah. Oh, definitely, it'll be a RCT, but
Yeah.
but it's not a test of UDL.
Uh-huh.
It's a test of this reading environment,
Of
this
UDL,
approach. So sometime tomorrow, I'd love to show that. But we couldn't do it if we didn't have the ability to support everybody's decoding, the ability to support everybody's vocabulary. We build that in so that they can read what they want. We don't dumb down the text. They're reading high-level stuff. What we are after is emotion first. We'll go after, in fact, one of our partners is Scholastic, the big Read 180 blunderbuss, because they too realize that their kids are tapping out. You know, there's only so much remediation before the emotional part of it becomes caustic, where you say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm ninth grade. And, you know, my friends are reading, you know, cool stuff, and I'm reading this stupid stuff on the bus. I don't want to be seen with it, you know. So we're saying, no, you're on the internet. You're going out and you're reading. The browser comes with you, and you can read what you want. I'm sorry, I've gone on too long. This is probably a time to stop, or what are you thinking? I'm not in a hurry, but you all have been.
Not at all. I mean, we had originally said we would go till about 5:30 today. So I think we should, you know, we'll have an all day to talk tomorrow. So we should, you know, just continue for 5 minutes or so, and
Another, what, 5 minutes?
yeah.
Okay. So antagonistic questions are welcome.
Why are you looking at me? He looks at the reading guy because it's just bashing on print the whole time.
But we like reading. We like high level reading. By the way, we have Catherine Snow's stuff. We're Generations part of our reading.
Oh, it must be good then.
And you know what? It is the best thing we have. We've got stuff from from Yahoo, stuff like that. But the good thing about Word Generation stuff is there's grit to it. There's reasons to read and argue and debate and things like that. So we find we have great analytics. It's actually unlike what people would think. People would think, oh, the kids are going to go for easy stuff when they can read anything. But actually, they're going for challenging, argumentative pieces that are written about should kids wear uniforms, or how bad are drugs anyway, things like that. And we're getting reading. And so the Word Generation are among the most popular articles. Beyonce beats them, but
Yeah.
other than Beyonce, they're among the most popular. And they sustain engagement. Kids come back to them. One of the measures, of course, is do kids come back to them? And kids don't come back to fraud, but they'll come back to those articles because they want to make an argument.
So I'll take a stab. I'm sure you get this all the time, but the kind of the classic cognitive, psychology model of learning, right? There's vertical transfer, right? You get these lower level skills on which you build these higher level skills. And, I think there's an extent to which that has to be true. This guy has to at some point understand what the words are to use them. And so it really seems to me like some of these tasks, the outcomes will depend, whether they outperform traditional teaching methods will depend on the assessment, right? And if the assessment is, did you understand the book?
Yeah.
They're able to read the book with your vocabulary supports
reading,
and decoding supports, then I think they'll likely do a lot better with your. But if it's how many, when you get out of this program 10 years down the line.
That was the exact thing I asked at the very beginning.
Yeah, how many books are you going to read? Yeah, it is very related to what Mark said. How many books are you going to read? I could really see it going either way. I mean,
Okay, so let me.
Yeah.
So there are two pushbacks.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you asked it because it's, of course, a rich question. And for one thing, the nervous system operates differently than we thought. The reason I wanted to show that slide of what comprehension really looks like is because people think that old cognitive hierarchy, you work your way up through lower level skills all the way to reading, is not accurate for the way the nervous system reads. It reads in multiple ways at the same time. It's a parallel processing thing. That is the thing we have really learned. And in fact, as you know, if you study it, in fact, that its background knowledge makes you a better decoder, and et cetera. These are reciprocally connected.
Oh yeah, I don't think that's inconsistent with the classical model.
But it's inconsistent with the way that people apply the classical model, which is that people say, no, we're going to work our way up in education. That's what they take, I think, the wrong point of view. And we're saying that's not congruent with the way the nervous system learns things. It learns things in these multiply determined ways. And we need to be making sure that we're not sphincterizing comprehension in a way that makes sure that the other ways aren't usable by kids. That's what we're trying to do. Now, let me go to the second part of the question. Will they ever read books? Okay, so there's a bunch of answers. One is, okay, so how many people are reading books, in print anymore? And the answer we have from a lot of the kids we work with is, yeah, you know what, they don't read printed books very much. But we're advising Amazon, for example, how do they make their books universally designed? Because it's not big, but it's another 10% market. They're big at the margins. And they realize, it wouldn't be hard for us to do this. And then we just have a bigger market. And so I think that this will all of their books will be like this. So people will read Wuthering Heights, but they aren't going to read it in print. And I think even Amazon gets it. We better prepare for this world. And there's not a big difference. Some people prefer print who are good decoders and good vocabulary, all these things. But some people just do not find print better under any circumstance. In fact, I'll tell you a classic example of my own class. Our book, our most recent book, is out in 4 versions. Standard print version in full color, digital version. Modification you're looking for. It has more features.
Oh.
And
The digital version, do you just mean like a book on a Kindle?
well,
What do you mean by digital
great.
version?
Thank you for asking. That's, I think, the distinction. It includes videos and all kinds of things, just richer media mix. Okay. So I signed it in my class. Kids have the option of the graduate students, whatever, and it's really interesting. What happens? Some people only buy the printed book. This is the universal design argument. Some people only use the digital, never buy it. But 40% of my students bought books. Because the print is really good for some circumstances and for some people. And the digital has other features, like it just has more interactivity, and they prefer that. But when they're at the beach, they don't want to take the stupid iPad. They want to take the print. So that's been our experience with most things we publish, that people worry that if we put out actually the digital version is free, and it could be just thought as cannibalizing the print sales. But actually I think it's like, people thought television was doing radio, but actually radio is more popular than before television. And I think that print is not going to go away because it has some really nice affordances. But for some people, it has no affordances. They're never going to use it again. And nor do they have to. And Park's going to be digital, so who cares?
Yeah, I actually do 90% of my reading in audiobooks nowadays. So you're kind of convinced me. But
I actually read print.
I just wonder how it'll do. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, if you're approaching the emotional side, and I really like this. This is great. Are there ways that you're going to, and what I'm going to say is that we know that one of the things that really works for both increasing interest and utility and all of those things is to have people work together. So how does the UDL include, opportunities to be engaged in social activity as well as
Great. So in the reading environment, maybe I'll try to show you. It places literacy entirely in the social context. They are in an online environment that looks more like Facebook than it looks like a print environment. And where their comments to each other, their reflections to each other, all of that is part of the corpus that they're reading and writing. And it has been the most effective thing. In fact, somebody asked me, the shocking thing is that we were really asked to do this largely for kids who have trouble reading. But we actually made a subgroup with schools for kids who are intellectually disabled, so really hardcore, that were not expected to read. And what we found is enormous commitment to reading and writing because it was so social for them. That instead of reading dumb single word things on flashcards, they were engaged with their peers in a legitimate literacy experience. And if they didn't know a word, they could click on it and so on. But we got a lot more. So we're going to write a separate reports now just on these incredibly challenged kids. But we think the largest issue is the emotional thing we got through to something they wanted to write. So some kids only read each other's projects. We've got stuff they could read, but one of the things we do is we publish kids' projects as one of the things you can read. So you're in class, you've got things from Yahoo, Scientific American, high-level stuff you can read, but you can also read the things Billy's been writing. And what we get is some kids only read that. And we're like, fine, because there's two beneficiaries. Billy writes more because he finds kids are reading his stuff. And the other people are reading more because they're reading Billy's stuff. That is their favorite author. And we have social literacy, which is what we really want.
So I think go ahead.
I was going to piggyback a question on Jackie's. It's my understanding, with learning things, that if it's done entirely in a technology environment, there's certain maybe pathways in the brain that we might build when we're away from the technology. And let's say we're learning about science if we're outside and immersed and that sort of thing. Are there opportunities for them to socialize, say, not online, but to pull out for small group interaction and discuss it in that way?
We are not advocates of entirely online. We don't like it for exactly the reasons you're mentioning. We think the human interaction is, in fact, lots of people say the nervous system was the large expansion of neocortex was to handle social complexity rather than just simply language or something like that. So it's crazy to pull the social out of the learning. It's what the brain is really good at. So we don't like environments. In fact, I don't remember whether we talked about it. We have a center that's studying online learning for kids with disabilities. And I am kind of suppressed in my ability to talk about it for reasons I wouldn't mind going into, but tomorrow. But there's an unholy alliance that's formed between unscrupulous vendors in the commercial sector who are targeting schools where they have a lot of kids with social emotional problems, with various learning disabilities. And they say, we will take your kids and we will individualize their instruction. And what we see is horrible. We see that essentially it's a regression to the old way that the kids with disabilities are now back in the basement. They're at home, and we've gone into the homes to see what really happens. And we do not like what we're seeing. They're essentially being
That's like your kids,
homeschooled by
Veronica.
parents who are not skilled at the disability, who need social interactions themselves. So anyway, we're not in the camp of thinking that, and I like that in one of your first things you said is this needs to be integrated in real classrooms. We're very much there. We think kids need to be in connection with real other peers, and we do not think we should pull kids out. It's right now, it's a very restricted environment, what we can do on technology compared to the complexity. You think of what kids, when you're talking to another kid, it's such a rich multimedia display that you're having to learn from. And then we kind of condense that into what we can do on a screen. It's so limited that I would never want to. That'd be like dumbing down the text, dumbing down the social interaction of what we can do digitally. It's not a good idea. I think there's a lot of things digital can do better. And by the way, there's some kids, autistic kids actually really bloom often in these environments because the face-to-face is not so threatening to them. But we still would not advocate that they be as they are. There are some schools that are putting all their autistic kids out of face-to-face placements, and we think that's just wrong. But the problem is there's an immediate burst. The kids are bullied. The kids seem like they're intentional in acting and stuff. And so I think it's a short-term victory, and I think it's unconscionable that schools are allowing that to happen. Because essentially schools are saying these kids are hard, and we're okay if they're not here. So we're not technology advocates. We're really learning advocates. We don't think you need to use the technology what it's good for, not what it's destructive for.
Okay, so let's wrap up today, and we'll talk tomorrow at 8:30. And David, we'll go out for dinner.